The Cold Thrones. In a kingdom where the moon never slept and the sun was only a distant memory, there lived a king who had forgotten what it meant to feel anything at all. His name was spoken in whispers across the land, and mothers told their children stories about him when they refused to sleep, saying that the vampire king could hear every heartbeat within 1,000 miles and that he fed on the souls of those who dared to dream of happiness in his dark domain. But what the stories never told, what the legends always forgot to mention, was that this king was once just a boy who loved too deeply, trusted too completely, and lost everything in a single night that changed him forever. 300 years had passed since that terrible evening when flames consumed his village, when the woman he loved betrayed him to hunters who wanted nothing more than to see his entire bloodline destroyed, and when he was forced to watch everyone he cared about turn to ash while he stood powerless and broken in the shadows. From that night forward, he made a promise to himself that would become the very foundation of his existence. He would never allow himself to love again, never permit his heart to feel the warmth of connection, and never let another soul get close enough to hurt him the way she had hurt him all those centuries ago. The vampire king sat upon his throne made of obsidian stone, carved from the heart of a mountain that no longer existed, and he watched the endless parade of servants and nobles who moved through his palace like ghosts afraid to make a sound. His eyes were the color of liquid silver, and they held no warmth, no curiosity, and certainly no hope for anything beyond the cold routine that had become his eternal life. Beside him stood his most trusted advisor, an ancient vampire named Marcus who had served the throne for over 500 years, and who remembered the days when his king still smiled, still laughed, and still believed that the world contained beauty worth protecting. Marcus watched his king with sadness hidden deep within his chest, knowing that somewhere beneath all that ice and indifference, there still existed the young man who once picked wildflowers for a woman who would eventually destroy him. But he had long since given up trying to reach that buried soul, because every attempt only pushed the king further into his isolation. On this particular night, something unusual was about to happen, something that would set into motion a chain of events that no one in the kingdom could have predicted. The heavy doors of the throne room swung open with a thunderous echo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace, and a group of royal guards marched in with a prisoner held between them, a figure so small and seemingly insignificant that several nobles in the room actually laughed at the sight. The king did not laugh because the king never laughed, but he did allow one eyebrow to rise slightly in what might have been curiosity, or might have been irritation at having his silence disturbed by such trivial matters as a human prisoner being dragged before his throne. The guards threw the prisoner onto the cold marble floor, and when the figure landed, the hood that had been covering their face fell away to reveal something that made the entire room fall into a silence so complete that you could have heard a pin drop from a mile away. It was a woman, young and clearly human, with dark hair that cascaded around her shoulders like a waterfall of midnight, and eyes the color of autumn leaves just before they fall from the trees. But what struck everyone in the room was not her beauty, though she was indeed beautiful in a simple and unassuming way, but rather the defiance that burned in those amber eyes as she lifted her head and stared directly at the vampire king without a single trace of fear visible in her expression. No one looked at the king that way, not the nobles who had lived for centuries and wielded enough power to destroy entire cities, not the warriors who had fought in wars that shaped the very landscape of this dark world, and certainly not a human prisoner who should have been trembling and begging for mercy at the feet of the most powerful creature in existence. The king felt something stir inside his chest, something unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable, and he immediately pushed it down with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 3 centuries burying every emotion that dared to surface. Marcus stepped forward to explain the situation, his voice carefully neutral as he addressed his king with the formal respect that protocol demanded. This woman, he said, had been caught stealing from the royal blood reserves, the precious stores of blood that were collected as tribute from surrounding human villages and kept in enchanted vessels deep within the palace vaults. And according to the laws of the kingdom, such a crime was punishable by immediate death without trial or mercy. The king nodded slowly, already preparing to wave his hand and order the execution that would end this minor disturbance and allow him to return to his preferred state of silent contemplation. But before he could speak, the woman did something that no one in that throne room would ever forget. She stood up despite her chains, despite the guards who tried to push her back down, despite every instinct that should have told her to remain small and submissive in the presence of such overwhelming power. And she spoke directly to the king in a voice that was clear and strong and filled with a courage that seemed almost impossible given her circumstances. She said that she was not sorry for what she had done because she had done it to save children who would have died without the medicine that required vampire blood to create. And she said that if protecting innocent lives made her a criminal in the eyes of this kingdom, then she would gladly accept whatever punishment awaited her. She said that she had heard stories about the vampire king and his cold heart, about how he cared nothing for the suffering of those beneath him and how he had turned his back on compassion centuries ago. But she also said that she did not believe those stories because she refused to accept that anyone could truly be so empty, so devoid of humanity, that they would let children suffer when the power to help them sat unused in palace vaults gathering dust. The room was absolutely silent when she finished speaking, and every vampire present was certain that they were about to witness the most brutal execution in the history of the kingdom, because no one, absolutely no one, had ever spoken to the king with such boldness and lived to see another moonrise. The king rose from his throne for the first time in weeks, and he descended the obsidian steps with a slow and deliberate grace that reminded everyone watching of a predator approaching its prey. He stopped directly in front of the woman, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his ancient body, close enough that he could hear the racing of her heart despite the calm expression she fought to maintain on her face. He studied her for what felt like an eternity, taking in every detail of her features, the stubborn set of her jaw, the slight trembling of her hands that she hid behind her back, the way she refused to look away from his silver eyes even though every survival instinct in her body must have been screaming at her to submit. Something shifted in the king's chest, something that felt suspiciously like interest, and he found himself asking her name before he even realized that he intended to speak at all. She told him her name was Elena, and she told him that she was not afraid to die because she had already made peace with that possibility the moment she decided to break into the palace and take what those sick children needed. The king felt the corner of his mouth twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile, though it disappeared so quickly that no one could be certain they had actually seen it. Instead of ordering her execution, instead of making an example of this defiant human woman who dared to challenge his authority in front of his entire court, the vampire king made a decision that would echo through history and change both of their lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. He said that she would not die tonight because someone who cared so deeply about the lives of others might prove to be useful to the kingdom, and he ordered that she be taken to the palace chambers and kept as his personal prisoner until he decided what to do with her. As the guards led Elena away, she turned back one final time and met the king's eyes, and something passed between them in that brief moment, something electric and terrifying and completely unexpected. The king felt his ancient heart skip a beat for the first time in 300 years, and the sensation was so startling that he actually placed his hand over his chest, as if checking to make sure the organ was still working properly. Marcus watched this exchange with wide eyes, hardly daring to believe what he was witnessing, and he felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest for the first time in decades. But in the shadows of the throne room, hidden behind a pillar where no one could see, stood a figure who watched these events unfold with burning hatred in their eyes. A figure from the king's past who had believed themselves forgot and who now saw in this human woman a threat that needed to be eliminated before she could ruin everything that had been so carefully planned for centuries. The cracking ice. The weeks that followed Elena's arrival at the palace were unlike anything the Dark Kingdom had experienced in living memory, and the whispers that traveled through the corridors spoke of strange changes that seemed to center around the mysterious human prisoner who had somehow escaped execution and earned a place within the royal household. Elena had been given a small but comfortable chamber near the library, a decision that confused the nobles who expected her to be locked in the dungeons or forced into hard labor. And she spent her days performing tasks that the king assigned her with a mixture of frustration and determination that the servants found both amusing and admirable. The king told her that she would work in the palace until she had repaid the debt she owed for stealing from the royal stores. And though the arrangement felt suspiciously like an excuse to keep her close rather than an actual punishment, Elena accepted it because she was alive, and because being alive meant she could still fight for the people who depended on her in the village where she had grown up. The Vampire King found himself doing something he had not done in centuries, something that confused and frustrated him in equal measure. He was watching her. Whenever Elena walked through the corridors, he seemed to appear from nowhere, his silver eyes following her movements with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead only made her more determined to prove that she was not intimidated by his power or his reputation. He assigned her tasks that brought her into close contact with him, requiring her to organize ancient documents in his private study, to assist in the cataloging of rare artifacts in the royal collection, and to read aloud from human books that he claimed to need translated, but that Elena suspected he understood perfectly well. She was not foolish enough to believe that the most powerful vampire in existence actually needed her help with anything, but she played along because each interaction gave her the opportunity to see past the cold mask he wore and glimpse the wounded creature that lurked beneath the surface. One evening, Elena was working late in the library when the king entered through a hidden door that she had not known existed, and she jumped so violently at his sudden appearance that she knocked an entire shelf of books onto the floor. He helped her pick them up, his cold fingers brushing against her warm ones in a way that made them both freeze for a moment, and when their eyes met in the candlelight, Elena saw something vulnerable flickering in those silver depths before he quickly looked away and rebuilt his walls. She asked him why he was really keeping her here, demanding honesty with the same fearlessness that she had shown in the throne room, and he told her that he did not know, that for the first time in 300 years he was doing something without understanding his own motivations. The confession seemed to cost him something, and Elena felt her heart soften slightly toward this ancient creature who had clearly been carrying unbearable pain for longer than she could comprehend. The king told her about his past that night, sitting in the shadows of the library while candles flickered around them and cast dancing shapes on the ancient walls. He told her about the village where he was born, about the family who loved him before the curse changed everything, and about the woman named Victoria who had promised to love him forever and then handed him over to hunters who wanted to mount his head on a wall. Elena listened without interrupting, her amber eyes glistening with tears that she did not try to hide, and when he finished speaking, she did something that shocked them both. She reached out and placed her warm hand over his cold one in a gesture of comfort that transcended the boundaries between their species. The king stared at their joined hands as if he had never seen anything so confusing in his entire existence, and Elena watched as a single crack appeared in the ice that surrounded his heart, small but undeniable and precious beyond measure. But their growing connection was not happening in secret, and there were those within the palace who watched with growing alarm as the feared vampire king began to show signs of weakness that they had never expected to see. Marcus observed the changes with cautious hope, seeing in Elena the possibility of redemption for a king who had been lost in darkness for far too long, but not everyone shared his optimism. The figure who had hidden in the shadows during Elena's first appearance at court had been watching every interaction between the king and the human woman, and with each passing day her hatred grew stronger and her plans became more deadly. Her name was Victoria, the very same woman who had betrayed the king 3 centuries ago, and through dark magic and blood rituals she had survived all these years with a single purpose burning in her corrupted heart. If she could not have him, then no one would. Victoria had never expected the king to move on because she believed that her betrayal had destroyed him completely, and that the broken shell of a man who remained would never be capable of feeling anything again. She had watched from a distance as he built his kingdom, as he conquered lands and accumulated power, and she had told herself that his success was hollow because he was alone and would remain alone forever. But now there was Elena, This ordinary human woman who somehow looked at the king without fear and who was slowly awakening emotions that Victoria had been certain were dead. The jealousy that consumed Victoria was irrational and dangerous, twisted by centuries of dark magic into something barely recognizable as a human emotion, and she began to formulate a plan that would not only destroy Elena but would also prove to the king once and for all that love was a weakness that would always lead to suffering. Elena knew nothing of the danger that was gathering in the shadows, and she continued to spend her days working alongside the king with a growing warmth that surprised her more than anyone. She discovered that he loved poetry, particularly the works of human writers who explored themes of loss and redemption, and she found herself reading to him in the evenings while he sat by the fire and listened with an expression that was almost peaceful. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly in moments of quiet conversation, and she discovered that he cared deeply about his people despite his cold exterior, often making decisions that prioritized their well-being over his own comfort or reputation. The monster that the stories described was not the creature she was coming to know, and Elena felt herself developing feelings that she knew were dangerous and impossible, but that she could not seem to control. One night, during a celebration for the winter solstice, Elena wore a gown that the king had sent to her chamber without explanation, a beautiful creation of deep blue velvet that made her amber eyes shine like polished gold. When she entered the great hall, the king stopped mid-conversation and stared at her with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. And when he crossed the floor to take her hand and lead her to a dance that no one had expected him to participate in, the whispers that erupted were louder than any announcement could have been. They moved together as if they had been dancing for centuries, as if their bodies understood each other in ways that transcended time and species and all the barriers that should have kept them apart. And when the music ended and they stood breathless in each other's arms, the king leaned close to Elena's ear and spoke words that she would remember for the rest of her life. He told her that he had believed love was nothing more than a beautiful lie designed to weaken those foolish enough to believe in it, but she was making him question everything he thought he knew, and he was terrified because she had become important to him in a way that he could not control or understand. Before Elena could respond, before she could tell him that she felt the same terrifying pull toward him, a scream echoed through the great hall and chaos erupted as dark magic exploded from the shadows. Victoria had chosen this moment to make her move, summoning creatures of darkness that tore through the celebration with deadly precision, and in the confusion she managed to reach Elena before anyone could stop her. The king watched in horror as Victoria's face emerged from the shadows, unchanged by centuries of time, and he felt his heart stop beating entirely as the woman who had destroyed him once before grabbed Elena by the throat and held a blade of pure shadow against her chest. Victoria's voice was like poison as she spoke, telling the king that she had waited 300 years to see him suffer again and that now she would take away the one thing that had brought light back into his miserable existence. Elena looked at the king, her amber eyes filled not with fear for herself but with concern for him, and she mouthed words that made his ancient heart shatter into a million pieces. "Save the others, let me go." The king felt something break inside him, felt the walls he had built crumbling faster than he could rebuild them, and he realized in that terrible moment that he had failed to protect his heart after all because this human woman had somehow become everything to him. Victoria laughed at his anguish, savoring the pain on his face like the finest wine, but she made the mistake of underestimating Elena, of seeing her as nothing more than a weak human caught between two immortals. In a flash of movement that no one expected, Elena drove her elbow into Victoria's chest and twisted away from the shadow blade, giving the king just enough time to act, but the blade still found its mark, slicing deep into Elena's shoulder and filling the air with the scent of her blood as she collapsed to the marble floor. The eternal dawn. The moment Elena's blood touched the marble floor, something changed in the vampire king that no one had ever witnessed before, and the power that erupted from him was so overwhelming that even Victoria, with all her dark magic and centuries of preparation, felt genuine fear for the first time since she had set this terrible plan into motion. His silver eyes turned completely black, the color of endless void and ancient fury, and shadows themselves seemed to bend away from him as if afraid to be caught in the path of his rage. The nobles and servants who had been celebrating just moments before pressed themselves against the walls and prayed to whatever gods might listen that they would not be caught between the king and the woman who had dared to hurt the one he loved. Because they understood now what had happened. They understood that the cold and distant ruler they had feared for centuries had finally found something worth fighting for, and that nothing in this world or any other would stop him from protecting her. Victoria tried to run, but the shadows themselves betrayed her, wrapping around her ankles and holding her in place while the king advanced with slow and terrible purpose. She screamed that he could not hurt her, that they were bound by the ancient blood she had stolen from him when she betrayed him 3 centuries ago, but the king merely smiled in a way that was far more frightening than any expression of anger could have been. He told her that she was right, that they were bound by blood and that for 300 years that connection had protected her from his wrath. But she had made one fatal mistake by attacking Elena because the moment she spilled innocent blood in his presence, the ancient compact between them shattered like glass. The king did not kill Victoria because death would have been too merciful for what she had done. Instead, he stripped away the dark magic that had kept her young and powerful, and in the span of a single heartbeat she aged 3 centuries, crumbling to dust before the horrified eyes of everyone watching. The king rushed to Elena's side the moment Victoria was gone, gathering her in his arms with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone who had just demonstrated such devastating power, and his voice cracked with emotion as he begged her to stay with him, to hold on just a little longer while he found a way to save her. Elena's blood was everywhere, warm and red against his cold skin, and the wound from the shadow blade was spreading darkness through her veins that no ordinary healing could reverse. Marcus appeared beside them with ancient texts and desperate suggestions, and the other vampires in the room offered their blood and their magic and anything else that might help. But the king knew that none of it would be enough because shadow wounds were designed to kill slowly and painfully, and there was no cure that existed in the known world. Elena reached up with a trembling hand and touched the king's face, her fingers leaving trails of blood on his pale cheek, and she told him not to be sad because she had always known her life would end eventually, and she was grateful that she had spent her final days knowing someone like him. The king felt tears running down his face for the first time in 3 centuries, hot and bitter and completely beyond his control, and he told her that she could not leave him, that she had just begun to teach him how to feel again and he was not ready to lose her. He would never be ready to lose her. Elena smiled despite the pain that was clearly consuming her, and she told him that what he felt for her, this love that he had denied for so long, was proof that he was not the monster the stories made him out to be. And she told him that loving someone, even when that love brought pain, was the most human thing a person could do. The king held her closer as her heartbeat began to slow, and he made a decision that would change the course of history in their world. A decision that he knew might not work, but that he had to try because the alternative was unthinkable. He bit into his own wrist and offered his blood to Elena, ancient blood that carried power beyond measure, blood that had never been shared with another living creature since his own transformation centuries ago. He told her that he did not know if this would save her or kill her faster, that vampire blood reacted differently to every human, and that the shadow poison in her veins made everything uncertain, but he could not let her die without trying everything in his power to save her. Elena looked at him with those amber eyes that had somehow become his entire world, and she nodded her consent, trusting him completely despite everything she had heard about vampires and their nature, trusting him because she had seen his true heart and she knew that he would never hurt her. The blood hit her tongue and Elena's body arched in pain as two opposing forces battled within her, the ancient vampire power fighting against the shadow poison that was trying to claim her life. The king held her through convulsions that should have broken her bones, whispering words of encouragement and love that flowed from him more easily than he ever imagined possible, telling her that she was strong enough to survive this, that she was the strongest person he had ever known, and he believed in her with every fiber of his eternal being. Minutes felt like hours and hours felt like years as the battle raged inside Elena's body. And everyone watching held their breath because they knew that what happened next would determine not just Elena's fate, but the future of their king and their entire kingdom. And then, just when hope seemed lost, just when the king began to feel the terrible weight of failure crushing his chest, Elena's heartbeat stabilized and her eyes opened, and they were no longer amber but a swirling mixture of amber and silver that marked her as something entirely new, neither human nor vampire but something in between that had never existed before. She looked up at the king with wonder in her strange new eyes, and she told him that she could feel everything, the pulse of the night, the whispers of the shadows, the beating of his heart that had started again when she woke up. The king laughed, actually laughed out loud for the first time in 3 centuries, and the sound was so unexpected and so full of joy that several vampires in the room started crying without understanding why. In the days that followed, Elena adjusted to her new existence with the same determination and courage that had defined her from the very beginning, and the king stayed by her side through every challenge and every discovery, never letting her doubt for a single moment that she was loved and valued and exactly where she belonged. The kingdom that had been ruled by fear for so long began to transform under their joint leadership, with the king learning from Elena that compassion was not weakness, and Elena learning from the king that strength did not require cruelty. Together they created new laws that protected humans and vampires alike, that honored the dignity of all creatures regardless of their species, and that established the kingdom as a place where anyone could find refuge if they were willing to treat others with respect and kindness. Marcus watched all of this unfold with tears of joy streaming down his ancient face, knowing that he was witnessing something that would be remembered long after all of them had turned to dust, something that proved even the coldest heart could be warmed by love if the right person came along at the right moment. The vampire king, who had declared for 3 centuries that he did not believe in love, stood before his people with Elena by his side. And he told them that he had been wrong about many things in his long life, but nothing more than his belief that isolation was protection, and that feeling nothing was better than risking pain. He said that Elena had taught him that love was not a weakness, but the greatest strength a person could possess, and that he was grateful beyond words that she had been brave enough to look past his walls and see the broken man who desperately needed to be saved. Elena and the king were married under the eternal moon, in a ceremony that brought together humans and vampires in celebration for the first time in recorded history, and the joy that filled the kingdom that night seemed to banish the shadows themselves. The children from Elena's village, the same children she had risked her life to save by stealing vampire blood for their medicine, served as flower bearers and ring carriers, and their laughter echoed through the ancient palace halls like the most beautiful music anyone had ever heard. When the king kissed his bride and declared her his queen, the cheers that erupted could be heard for miles in every direction, and somewhere in the distant corners of the world, those who had believed that darkness would rule forever felt hope stir in their hearts for the first time. Years passed, and then decades, and then centuries, and the kingdom that Elena and her king built together became a legend that parents told their children when they wanted to teach them about the power of courage and love. Elena never aged because of the unique transformation she had undergone, and she ruled beside her king with wisdom and compassion that made her beloved by all who knew her. They adopted orphans of every species and raised them as their own, creating a family that was as diverse as the kingdom they protected, and each child grew up knowing that they were loved unconditionally and that their worth was not determined by the circumstances of their birth. The vampire king, who had once believed that love was nothing but a beautiful lie, became known throughout the land as the king who proved that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn, and his story was told as proof that no heart is ever truly beyond saving. And so the legend ends, not with tragedy as so many vampire stories do, but with hope and light and the simple truth that love, real love, the kind that sees past walls and wounds and centuries of pain, is the most powerful magic in any world. Elena and her king lived happily for eternity, surrounded by family and friends and the countless lives they touched through their kindness. And though challenges came and went as they always do, they faced everything together with the unshakable knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they needed. The vampire king who said he did not believe in love became the greatest love story their world had ever known, and all because one brave human woman looked at a monster and saw a man worth saving.